In this lecture, I'll be discussing economic anthropology. From this opening slide here, you can see the work of economic anthropologist Wee Hong, Spirits of Resistance in the Capitalist Discipline, Factory Women in Malaysia. I'll be talking about this in just a little bit, as well as a picture that I took in Pike's Market in Seattle, where many individuals made a sort of pilgrimage down to visit the what was perceived to be the first Starbucks. This lecture will look at economic anthropology from a variety of different perspectives and in relation to the field of economics. We'll be looking at, much like economics does, production, distribution, exchange, as well as consumption. Economic anthropology is that part of the discipline of anthropology that debates issues of human nature that relate directly to the decisions of daily life in making a living. Economics deals with making a living, acquiring products that are satisfying at the smallest cost. What this is basically referred to by economists as maximizing utility in terms of cost benefits, or maximizing utilities overall. In terms of economists as a whole, there's this notion of scarcity. And very much in the United States, we fundamentally believe in the notion of scarcity, and we see this played out at times like Christmas, where there's the favorite toy that everyone desires, and there's not enough of those to go around, so there's all these struggles to try to compete for limited resources. And along with this, there's this lack of satiation or lack of happiness that goes along with never having quite enough, and that there's never quite enough resources to fulfill these desires. These desires are infinite and always expanding with things like new fashion, new technology, the latest thing to impress individuals. If we step back and look at this from a cultural relativist point of view, we might note that this notion of economic rationality being applied across the globe to all cultures is indeed ethnocentric in nature. Much like economists, anthropologists look at the three phases of economic activity: production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. Here we'll focus on labor, including modes of production, means of production, relations of production. We'll also look at distribution and exchange, or gift and commodity exchanges, reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchanges, as well as consumption, the internal and external explanations, as well as authenticity and sustainability. This picture here is a picture of an informal economy market. These are, of course, proliferating across the globe in many regions, including the United States and so-called less developed countries, where a number of goods from people at the bottom of the pyramid can essentially have a tremendous amount of buying power collectively, even though their relative buying power is small in relation to individual consumers. In terms of production, production is the activity linking human social groups to the material world around them. From the point of view of Karl Marx, labor is therefore always social labor. And our conceptions of labor and what is appropriate for labor has changed historically over time. Here you can see a picture of early mills in the United States where child labor was frequently utilized. Today there are many laws that prevent child labor, particularly in factories, whereas child labor in places like family farms would still be permitted in some contexts. Labor is a central Marxian concept. Physical labor determines the production of food, clothing, shelter, tools, and mental labor is what permits people to organize their labor in different ways. According to Marx, there are modes of production, means of production, and relations of production, and these are categories that have been utilized since by anthropologists and others. Marx's categories of modes of production signify a specific historically occurring set of social relations through which labor is deployed to wrest energy from nature by means of tools, skills, organization, and knowledge. The means of production are those tools, skills, organization, and knowledge used to extract energy from nature, whereas the relations of production are the social relations linking the people who use a given means of production with a particular mode of production. Different types of labor were assigned to different classes, where you have rank groups within a hierarchically stratified society whose membership is defined primarily in terms of wealth, occupation, or other economic criteria. So you see not only Marx's notions here, but also Max Weber's work coming in here on wealth, occupation, and status. Karl Marx had 8 different modes of production that he outlined. Wolff outlines 3 of these as vital to human history. First, the kin-ordered mode is when social labor is organized by kinship relations. We typically see these amongst foraging, hunting, and gathering societies, as well as farmers and herders who are not organized by domination. They typically follow this model. There can, of course, be rules along lines by gender or gerontocracy, rule by the old, but nevertheless, there's individual work with particular products, so maybe along the lines of gender or age. In the tributary mode, this involves the primary producer having access to the means of production in accordance to a tribute paid to a political entity. This mode can exist when farmers are part of a social system divided by class. So you have farmers who are paying some sort of tribute to be able to continue to farm, but they nevertheless have access to the means of production. They are not alienated from those means of production. In the capitalist mode of production, you see alienation from the production, the means of production, which is then privately owned and controlled by the capitalist class. Again, this is where many students get tripped up. Workers are required to sell their labor to the capitalist class in order to survive. The surpluses are produced to make a profit and then reinvested into production in order to make bigger yields for higher profits overall. In the anthropological context, there are many examples of production. Awia Ong's work with semiconductor production in Malaysia, where she talks about spirits of possession that occur when women work long hours in relatively dangerous conditions, both perceived in both Western context as well as culturally with close proximity to water. Jane Collins talks about deterritorialization and workplace culture, where she follows the garment industry from a small town, a company town in Virginia down into Latin America and then eventually to China. Mark Moberg talks about the notions of segmentation in the Belizean banana industry along the lines of both class and nationality, and then different discourses which surround the idea that particular nationalities are better or worse at labor in particular context. Ong and Collins both talk about this in the context of naturalizing discourses around gender and women as ideal workers for their so-called docile bodies and nimble fingers. Pickering talks about the notion of decolonizing time regimes amongst the Lakota Sioux and their conceptions of work, economy, and society, noting the difference between time that's allocated towards task versus time that's allocated towards a clock, these different modes of conceptualizing time. And a big part of the transition in so-called development of Native American societies was the movement from task-oriented labor to time-oriented labor, where the clock became really essential, where there was a really sharp segregation between work and recreation. And Pickering notes in the Lakota society today, in the nation, that there is not that legacy of the colonization of time is starting to be broken apart and resisted by contemporary Lakota who are mixing work with play and with recreational opportunities overall. Economists also study distribution and exchange. In neoclassical economic theory, you have a formal attempt to explain the workings of capitalist enterprise with particular attention to distribution. This is the foundation of early economists who at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution began to study changes to economic and social lives of Europeans. We can think about capitalism as an economic system dominated by the supply-demand price mechanism, which has been called the market, and the entire way of life that grew in response to this and in service of that market. The most prominent difference between capitalism and feudalism is regarding distribution of goods. Capitalist economic relations depend on the buyers and sellers, not the corresponding statuses of the lord and peasants under feudalism. Anthropological approaches have been cautious about applying neoclassical model of economics, which stress the centrality of market forces as driving production and consumption to all human societies. Instead, alternative economics were found to be practiced, including gift exchanges, where non-capitalist forms of economic exchanges that are deeply embedded in social relations and always require a return gift. On the other hand, you have commodity exchanges, which are impersonal economic exchanges typical of the capitalist market, in which goods are exchanged for cash and exchange partners need to have nothing further to do with one another. Polanyi devised three modes of exchange, patterns according to which distribution takes place: reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. Under reciprocity, the exchange of goods and services of equal value occur. There are three main types of reciprocity according to Polanyi: Generalized, an example would be parents and their children, when the exchange is done without the expectation of immediate or equal return. Balanced, an exchange that requires a return of equal value in a specific amount of time. And negative, when one party hopes to get something for nothing. So haggling over something would be an example of this. Redistribution is also practiced in the United States. Redistribution is a mode of exchange that requires some form of centralized social organization to receive economic contributions from all members of a group and to redistribute them in a way to provide for every group member. So the Internal Revenue Service and tax time is an example of this. Amongst the Tlingit and Northwest Coast peoples of North America, you also see potlatching, as well as amongst the Athabascans, in redistributive mechanisms. Historically, these large spoons that are displayed here in the middle were to harness ulican oil, which is a type of fish, which is very expensive. So there's a lot of status that was being carried in the context of these potlatches and as a redistributive mechanism. Market exchange refers to the exchange of goods calculated in terms of multi-purpose medium of exchange and standard value, which is money, carried out by means of the supply-demand price mechanism or the market. There are many ethnographic examples of distribution and exchange. Perhaps the most famous in Anthropology is Marcel Mauss's discussion of the gift, based upon Malinowski's work in the Trobriand Islands of Kula exchange, Kula and Gimwali exchange of prestige and everyday items amongst the Trobriand Islanders, and these would circulate in a very specific way, either clockwise or counterclockwise, and there would be a lot of shame for holding on to goods for an extended period of time. Daniel Herman, in her work Gift or Commodity, What Changes Hands at the U.S. Garage Sale, problematizes the notion that there's a sharp distinction between gift and commodity exchanges in the United States, noting, in fact, that gift and commodity exchanges are both occurring in the context of garage sales, where market prices are nowhere near demanded, and individuals instead barter with one another along the lines of gift and exchange for a particular product. And so with this, there could be a story that goes along with it, or the idea that someone's going to take care of your possession. Petra Rethman, in her work, Skins of Desire, Poetry and Identity in Koryak Women's Gift Exchange, talks about the idea of how women will sew furs for men in order to court them, and it essentially show that they will be excellent in marriage, excellent marriage partners, in their ability to contribute to the subsistence economy overall. Finally, anthropologists study consumption. And there are a number of different thoughts about consumption patterns. Consumption is the using of material goods necessary for human survival. There's the internal explanation, which comes from Malinowski along the lines of basic human needs. Malinowski stressed that people are principally driven by their basic needs, such as nourishment, reproduction, and health, and a society may be threatened if those needs are not met. And that is why institutions are formed in order to guarantee basic human needs, such as food getting, training, shelter, and kinship. A major shortcoming of Malinowski's analysis is that it did not help to explain why certain societies have different consumption patterns. There's also the external explanation in terms of cultural ecology, the resources of a particular habitat, and humans' adaptations to their local ecology would drive particular consumption patterns. And the cultural patterning of consumption. Humans will construct their own niches by way of tools, social relations, domesticated crops, agroecologies, and therefore construct their own patterns of consumption. In terms of consumption, we see some key ethnographic examples. Marshall Solon's ethnological work, based primarily around Richard Lee's work in the Kalahari, talks about the original affluent society and the Zen road to prosperity, wherein individuals in foraging societies feel like they are satiated or have attained enough by desiring less. This was based on time allocation studies in the 1950s and 60s amongst the Kalahari San, or the Johansi San, peoples of Richard Lee's work. In terms of consumption, there have been increasing questions regarding authenticity and intellectual property rights, in terms of rip-offs, fakes, copies, and these sorts of things across the globe. Also, in terms of consumption, we must ask ourselves, when facing world problems, the contemporary limits on consumption and sustainability issues overall. Much work in anthropologists focuses on this, including Kodak, Kresh, Gauch's, and Kirsch's work. Finally, I'd like to conclude with a brief discussion on scavengers. Scavengers indeed complicate a very formal distinction between production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. And there are many myths which anthropologists